there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology Podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I know that as the year starts to wind down, many of you will be thinking about next year, about 2025, and what might be in store. So in today's show, I want to share about a really fun and accessible timing technique that I use all the time, and that is the technique of profections. So profections are what's called a Time Lord timing technique. And in a Time Lord timing technique, a particular planet is identified as being important, like a ruler or a guiding planet for a given amount of time. So this idea of working with profections is going to help us identify an important planet for a set period of time. Profections are actually one of the simplest types of Time Lord techniques. There are many others, and some of them are a lot more complicated. And profections were widely used by ancient astrologers. So we kind of go back to, our early roots in astrology when we bring this technique forward. One of the reasons I love working with profections is that it is timed to your birthday. So it's a technique that can give us info, whether that's themes or topics or this important planet that is relevant for each year of your life. So today, what I want to do in the show is just take you through the very basics of profections. So you'll get the main premise of the techniques, the basic kind of mechanics, and you might even be ready to start playing around with this technique in your own chart. If you would like the full training on profections, I'm going to be teaching this in my Plan Your 2025 course, which starts on November 12th. In that predictive astrology course, which is taking place online, I'll take you through all the ins and outs of profections, including how to use monthly profections to create a personal calendar timed to your chart for next year. In addition, in this course, you will also learn about the major transits for 2025 to figure out what planets and what cycles are going to be most active for you. You can find out more about the Plan Your 2025 Year Ahead course over on my website, kellysastrology.com. You can also sign up, and I hope to see you in class. But for today, let's dive into the basics and the main gist of the technique of profections. So in profections, your age is linked to one or another of the various houses in the birth chart. Once we do that, we've got a house that is relevant for your age. And once you know the house, you'll have a sign and some planets that may be connected to that house that become influential for you for the year ahead. I'm not going to cover all of that today. That is too much to cover in one short podcast, but they're the kinds of things I will be covering in the course. And that really is the main gist of the technique. You know your age, everybody does that. Figure out which house that leads you to in your birth chart, and then you will know the sign and the planets that are important for you this year. The more that you understand about the sign and the planets, the more you'll be able to do from a predictive perspective. And even though that's the main gist of the technique, I know you'll probably want me to share a little bit more. And I do have a couple of examples that I will show you this technique in action with. So the first step, though, of course, is to figure out which house your current age is connected to. So, of course, there are only 12 houses in the birth chart, and you'll be older than 12 years of age. So the way we work this is that each birthday where your age is a multiple of 12 is going to be a first house year. So if you are 24 or 36, 48, 60, 72, or 84, you are in a first house profection year. Or if that's your age on your next birthday, you will be going into a first house profection year. So a first house profection year is generally associated with beginnings, with a fresh start, in the same way that the first house is the beginning or the start of the birth chart. The first house also has to do with identity and with personality, like habits and attitudes and behaviors. So you really get to put yourself first, and you're often working on personal growth when you're in a first house year. The first house is connected to the physical body. And so when you are in one of those first house years, it may be that there is a health or wellness focus that comes through as well. So if your birthday, if your current age, I should say, is a multiple of 12, it's really easy you are in a first house year. But that leaves many of us who aren't those particular ages. So how do you find your perfected house by age? So what you're going to want to do is count around from the first house, starting with your most recent birthday when your age was a multiple of 12. Let me give you an example so you can understand what I mean. For instance, if you are 39, your most recent birthday where your age was a multiple of 12 will have been when you turned 36. And we know that 36 is a first house year. So if you count forward from there, 36 in the first house, you'll end up with 37 in the second house. You'll go to the third house when you turn 38. And that means you're in the fourth house now that you've turned 39. That also means that 40 is a fifth house year for anybody who's paying attention. So you can count forward from your most recent birthday that was a multiple of 12, depending on your current age. You could do this in a different way as well. For instance, if you're 57, your next first house birthday will be when you turn 60. So you could go to the first house and then count backwards around the chart. For instance, if we know that 60 is a first house year, we could go backwards into the 12th house for 59, back again into the 11th house at 58, and back one more house into the 10th house for your 57th perfected year. So 57 is a 10th house year, 39 is a 4th house year, and just some basic counting can get you there. I do have a free PDF resource for the perfections that shows you in a visual form which ages go with which houses in the chart, and that's available for free download on my website. So you're welcome to grab that too if that's easier for you. So hopefully you've been able to connect your age to a house in your chart. So this is where we're now setting the scene for your themes for your current year or for your next birthday, depending on what age you're working with. So the topics of your perfected house become big themes. They're like interests or areas of focus for your perfected year. And I should mention that the year that we're talking about is your birthday year, not the calendar year. So your perfected year is something that resets every year on your birthday when you turn a different age. So in the example we were just using, 57 is a 10th house year, which means on your next birthday, when you turn 58, you will perfect or advance around to the 11th house. So whether you're kind of aware of this or not, you may notice that you are really going into the topics and areas of life indicated by your perfected house. So the next step is to note the sign on your perfected house cusp. Now, when I was first taught this technique more than 20 years ago by the absolutely amazing Demetra George, she did remind me that I needed to have my chart in the whole sign format for this technique. Even if you don't normally work with the whole sign house system, it is the one that I have always used for perfections. So once you know the sign that is on your perfected house, that is going to be a kind of a mood vibe for you for the year ahead. And you might imagine that if your perfected house is Sagittarius, there's more of a generally expansive, adventurous, or upbeat energy than if your perfected house is, say, Capricorn, which might be more serious or cautious or practical. Once you have, so far to recap, we've looked at our age, we've connected it to a house, we've maybe reminded ourselves of the topics of that house, we've now tuned into the sign that is on that house cusp. The next step, which is probably the most important, is to identify the traditional ruling planet of the sign that is on your perfected house. That planet becomes what's called your Time Lord for the year ahead. And that planet you could think of as your guiding light. It is like your mood setter, and it describes the quality of energy that you will be exploring and maybe experiencing for the year that it is your perfected Time Lord. So, your perfected Time Lord planet is super important in terms of both mood and experiences. And it generally kind of sets the quality of energy that you might be working with for this year. And you can imagine that the mood or the quality of energy for you would be very different if Mars is your Time Lord versus if Venus is, for instance. We know Mars is more bold and dramatic, it's more independently oriented, and it really wants to take the initiative and move things forward. Venus is a planet that is more collaborative, is more focused on enjoyment and connection. And so the vibe of your year is going to be very different if you're in a Mars ruled year versus a Venus ruled year. So there are lots of things that you can do with this perfected Time Lord once you know what it is. You can track it by transit, you can do a deep dive on it in your solar return. There's so much more that you can do with that planet. For today, though, I simply wanted to introduce this concept so that you can start thinking about your year ahead as being inspired by the topics and themes of your perfected house. I also wanted to invite you to start tuning into the influence of your Time Lord planet, really thinking about that planet in your natal chart and what it is interested in or how it operates. And then you can also think about that planet via transit. All of that level of detail I cover in the course. It is definitely more than we can squeeze in today. But to help show the technique of perfections in action, I want to take you through a couple of examples. Now, to do that, I'm going to use a couple of very topical examples. So I just want to make a little statement as we're getting into that. I know that many listeners are curious about the US presidential election. And so I want to talk you through what this perfections technique looks like in both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's charts. Now, I appreciate that this is a very hot topic for many people. And while I do always love to read your comments, I would encourage you to please keep things respectful in the comments section. I know that when you're learning astrology, seeing astrology in action, especially in regards to current events, can be so helpful. And so that's the spirit in which I want to work with these charts today. So first off, let's start with Trump. Trump is born in June, so his perfected year began on June 14 at his most recent birthday. He turned 78, so he is in a 7th house perfected year. Now, Trump is a Leo rising chart, and that means that Aquarius is on his descendant or 7th house cusp, which makes Saturn, the traditional ruling planet of Aquarius, his Time Lord for the year. So that's a fair bit of data. If that was your chart, you would be wanting to break down what each of those data points meant. So we know that Trump is in a 7th house perfected year. So we're going to have a focus perhaps on partnerships, on significant others, and this can be about personal associations or professional partnerships. To kind of tune a little bit more into Saturn and the mood or quality for the year, there are two versions of Saturn that we want to consider. First up, we want to look at where Saturn is in the natal chart. For Trump, Saturn is in Cancer in the 12th house. And we also want to take note of where transiting Saturn is. And of course, transiting Saturn is in Pisces, which means it's moving through Trump's 8th house. So if your Time Lord in the natal chart is in your 12th house, it might really highlight those 12th house themes. There may be themes of being more reclusive or pulling back or withdrawal. It might be that you are working through private matters or dealing with things that are happening behind closed doors. The 12th house can be connected to some topics that have a little bit of pain or suffering associated with them. So these can all be part of your experience if your Time Lord is natally in your 12th house. And so these won't be totally new themes for you because you have this planet in that 12th house, but it is a clue that whatever those themes are about, they're up for you a lot more this year. Now, as a general theme, if Saturn is your Time Lord, it certainly can indicate a heavier tone of energy. It can highlight Saturn's themes of contraction or even consequences. So we know with Saturn that we have to honor our agreements. And sometimes when we're having a big Saturn activation, we're being called to honor agreements. Now, the other piece for Trump, of course, is that Saturn, transiting Saturn as his time lord, is moving through the eighth house in his chart. And so natal Saturn is in the 12th, but transit Saturn is in the eighth, which gives a really current take on Saturn for Trump right now. And of course, the eighth house shows financial obligations. This can be debt or loans, it can be taxes. And of course, the eighth house is also one of our parts of the chart that can have an association with fear or worry or even emotional discomfort. So this is a really interesting combination that Saturn is the time lord for Trump, and we have both the 12th and the 8th houses highlighted either by natal Saturn in the 12th and transit Saturn in the 8th. So this combination, if you like, of Saturn and 8th and 12th house for Trump, it may highlight themes of retreat and withdrawal or of working on challenges in private. It can certainly indicate that there is that heavier energy, maybe grappling with long-term matters or matters that have been problematic for some time and trying to figure out, how to negotiate them. Often when I see things in charts of public figures, I often think about how would I talk about this to that person if they were my client or if my client was going through something similar. And so if this were a client, they were in a 7th house perfected year ruled by Saturn, and that was pulling in the 12th and the 8th houses, I would really be encouraging them to honor their obligations, to sort out healing for emotional or relationship worries or problems, and also to be really diligent and responsible with any outstanding debts, loans, or taxation matters, because I would imagine they would be very pressing and they would be weighing on the person quite heavily. Now, in a Leo rising chart, Saturn is also the ruler of the 6th house, where Capricorn, Saturn's other sign, would fall. And so health matters might also be a part of the story. Physical health, physical problems could also be in the mix here as well. There is another public example of a person who has some very similar perfected themes to Trump, and I'm sure you're going to know this story as well. That is the chart of Catherine, Princess of Wales. Now, she is also a Leo rising chart. She's much younger than Trump. She's 42, but that is also a 7th house perfected year. So Trump is 78, Catherine is 42, but they are both 7th house years. And because they have the same rising sign, they're both having Saturn perfected Aquarius 7th house years. So for Catherine, her birthday is back in January, January 9th. And so her Saturn ruled perfected year started at the very start of calendar year 2024. Shortly after that, she had a medical procedure and was diagnosed with cancer. So her Saturn themes aren't exactly the same. Her natal Saturn is in Libra in the 3rd house, but of course, transiting Saturn is in Pisces, which is her 8th house, the same as it is for Trump. And for her, there has been a lot of seclusion and withdrawal from regular duties to attend to her health. I can only imagine maybe the emotional worry and suffering from that Saturn in the 8th house that she may be navigating as well, given the major health diagnosis that she is working through. So I'm not saying that Trump and Princess of Wales Catherine have exactly the same things, but hopefully you can see there are some similarities. And it has certainly led to this very extreme, reclusive, secluded vibe for Catherine. And so it's really interesting to see how some of that might show up for Trump, whether you notice a difference in his presence perhaps, or if we see that even more so in the months looking forward, because Trump's 7th house perfected year ruled by Saturn in the 8th house does continue until his birthday in June of 2025. So to consider a different chart with a totally different set of perfection themes, let's look at Harris's chart. So Harris's birthday is October 20th, which means she has just had a birthday as you're listening to this. As a little side note, I'm recording this episode early in October, but I know that you won't be listening until later in the month. So as you're listening to this episode in the last week of October, Harris has just started a new perfected year. She turned 60 on October 20th. And so, of course, you might remember from the start of the show, that means that she is in a 1st house perfected year. I mentioned earlier that being in a first house year can be a year of beginnings and of fresh starts. It can be about exploring or updating your identity and maybe making some changes to your habits and your attitudes and your behaviors. Harris is a Gemini ascendant, and so if she's in a first house year, Gemini and its ruling planet Mercury become influential. And of course, that means Mercury becomes her time lord for this next 12 months. In her natal chart, Harris has Mercury in Scorpio in her natal sixth house. So that's going to be important. And by transit, Mercury is currently in Scorpio and then will move into Sagittarius on November 2nd. So let's break a little bit of that down. Harris's natal Mercury is in Scorpio in the sixth house. And that can highlight themes of work and service, of health. It can highlight how important daily routines, rituals, schedules might be. The sixth house is also associated with workers and people who might work in industries that have unions or other labor protections. That may or may not be relevant for all of us with sixth house themes, but if you're somebody in a position of power or a leadership role, that is certainly a topical thing to note. So that can speak to her work as VP and, potential job change as an area of focus for her. The sixth house, of course, is also a house that is connected to health and the medical services or the medical industry, health and wellness. And so those topics and themes will be a huge focus for Harris from October 24 through to October 2025. And we're just pulling in the natal placement of her Time Lord Mercury as it's located in the sixth house. If your Time Lord is natally placed in your sixth house, you too might be busy with work or other obligations. Maybe you're tuned in to service and support themes. All of those sixth house topics will become really central to the year ahead. I know that Harris has turned 60 and she's in a first house perfection, but the kind of first house year she will be defined partly by where Mercury is in the natal chart. Now, of course, some of you will be thinking Mercury moves really quickly, and that is true. And some of you will have Time Lord planets that are more quick moving. And that might mean that every 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, your Time Lord planet is changing signs and bringing a different mood or quality of energy forward for you. If your Time Lord is the moon, it's going to be changing signs every few days. So in the case of Harris, in terms of this latter part of 2024, Mercury is in Scorpio in October as she has her birthday. And then just a couple of weeks later, Mercury moves into Sagittarius, where unusually it's going to spend 2 months. And that, of course, is because Mercury will have a retrograde in Sagittarius. So if we're thinking about Harris at the start of this new perfected year, we know that Mercury is her Time Lord. It's generally about communication. And so we're going to have a lot of those Mercury themes as relevant for her. But it also means that Mercury in most of November, all of December, and the very start of January will be sitting in her natal 7th house. And so her Time Lord Mercury is on an extended stay in her 7th house. And that's going to highlight things like negotiation and discussion with significant others. So that could be romantic partnerships, personal partnerships, but of course, professional partnerships and alliances as well. And so the idea of how the role of relationship and interacting with others impacts her identity, because she is in a first house year and her Time Lord planet Mercury will be in the 7th house. But it's also about this idea of this new cycle beginning, because that's part of what being in a first house year is about. So with Mercury as her Time Lord, Harris is going to be really tuning into that Mercury energy, working as the messenger, the networker, the negotiator. And this is the planet that does rule the first house in her birth chart. So that's likely already an important signature in her chart, perhaps already descriptive of certain roles that she has played or that she has worked in the past. So this can be a year where Harris is really into and owning that Mercury side to her personality. To give a brief summary of what is ultimately a very quick look at the perfections in Trump's chart versus in Harris's chart, let's recap what we've talked about. Trump is 78 and in a 7th house year ruled by Saturn. Saturn is natally in the 12th house and currently transiting his 8th house. Harris is 60 and has just started a first house year that is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is natally in her sixth house and will shift into Sagittarius on November 2nd by transit, where it's going to spend 2 months. So that'll bring it into Harris's seventh house. So this quick look kind of indicates there is a much more heavier or challenging or even complex energy around Trump, just given that he's in a perfected year ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is tied to the 8th and 12th houses. And that can show that there may be some limitations to navigate or some consequences to manage. To contrast that, Harris is in a place of starting a new cycle, and there may be a process of redefining herself, especially in regards to partnerships, both personally and professionally, and skills or topics of a Mercury nature. So lots of papers and documents, the intellect and the intellectual side of life, communication, negotiation, and business deals, all really emphasized for Harris in this Mercury perfected year, because all of those things are under the purview of Mercury. So this is just a very small, very basic introduction to the technique of profections. I'm sure you have questions about the technique and how it works. You're welcome to post a few below, but I would really encourage you to jump in to the Plan Your 2025 course that I'm teaching in November, where I will be going through so much more about profections, and most of your questions would be answered there, I imagine. So hopefully, though, this has given you a sense of the technique, a place to begin in terms of thinking about your chart from a timing perspective. And of course, if you do want even more about the nuances and the specifics and the technicalities of working with profections, I hope to see you in class in November. As always, you are absolutely welcome to post questions or observations about the show in the comments below, but please do be respectful. I will be back to share more about the upcoming full moon, which will be in Taurus in next week's show. Until then, everyone, take care.